Cool. Well, I know that we discussed at the end of last week around going into hopping strategies. But again, before we get to hopping strategies, I really want you guys to understand some pretty advanced underlying physics properties of the human body before we then get into specifics of an ACL, right? And I'll just share this. Let me share my screen. Cool. You guys can see that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So today is about force plate considerations from weeks kind of 12 to 20 plus, just building on what we went through last fortnight around that kind of return to run. The next steps is about, I've put weeks 12 to 20 plus because it is a very wide range. But at this point, this is information and data using the force plates that we can utilize when we start to go beyond running, right? So we're not going into change of direction or anything just yet. This is about understanding the principles that are required in the knee and around the knee for us to make decisions based off of, okay, what are we progressing? When are we progressing? Cool. I will put a disclaimer. I've put in here ACL force plate considerations. Just understand that there are thousands of considerations that we can go through. Today, to keep it simple, I really want to just try and narrow it down to probably 3 or 4 considerations. There could be hundreds of thousands of considerations when we're going through this, but I'm just trying to make it super simple. Cool. Looking at a counter movement jump to start with. In terms of us at Optimus, we're really lucky because we've got the valved force plates to be able to measure some of these things, and in particular, force time graphs of vertical ground reaction force. So breaking just that counter movement jump aspect, not going into landing just yet, but just the jump aspect. We've got the A, B, C, D, E on this graph. And in particular today, we're going to be looking at deceleration of the jump phase and the landing phase, okay? Let's start with the basic physics of stress, strain, failure. So if we took any physical property, let's normally in high school in year 11, year 12, you go through a stress strain curve of steel compared to concrete. This is just the mechanical properties of a ligament substance that they've put down in a linear stress strain curve. So what they've shown here is that as you increase stress on one aspect, the strain of that ligament will change until there's an ultimate stress level, and then you get failure. Now that's a linear stress strain curve that they put in textbooks. Ligaments and real life living physiological ligaments that have got collagen fibers and what I describe as strength cables, and then you've got intrasubstance matrix, and you've got extracellular matrix, and you've got vascular and neural things running through that same ligament. It's actually not a linear stress strain curve when we're in particular talking about MCL or ACLs. This is what it looks like more accurately, I'm going to describe it as. And so if you have a look at that toe region, that's where the fibers of, say, an MCL are crimped, and there's almost almost zero load on that MCL, right? And then what happens is as you increase the stress and you straighten those fibers, you can see that there's, stress through that linear region. and through that physiological range. Now, once you start increasing that, the thing about ligaments is that they're viscoelastic. So it actually depends on the speed that you apply the force to, which actually changes the stress strain curve, right? So that ligament behaves differently if you stretch slowly compared to if you stretch really quickly. And that's why it's a non-linear stress strain curve, because it happens at different speeds. To keep it simple, I'm just going to use this one. Pretend that this is a very, very fast stress that we put on. The key aspect here is for ACLs, ideally we want to keep things below that microscopic failure physics. Okay. It does change. Those two big arrows is the area where we kind of want to stay away from, and definitely want to stay away from macroscopic failure. And again, another disclaimer is that this stress strain curve is very different in a patellar tendon graft or a quad tendon graft compared to a hamstring graft. And also it could vary surgeon to surgeon, technique to technique, hospital to hospital. If you speak to, Stryker or any of those equipment manufacturers, they'll also say that their equipment has different stress strain curves on this. To keep it really simple, I'm just going to clump it all together, and we're just going to work on one model of a stress strain curve, being this one today. Cool. So how does this relate to ACL, our rehab as physiotherapists, and specifically what we're measuring with the force plates weeks 12 to 20? We'll start with, based on video analysis, and this differs massively, but ACL injuries generally believed to occur, we're talking about non-contact, change of direction ACL ruptures. We know that they happen between 0 to 67 milliseconds of initial ground contact. All right. Now, you can see here this Peterson NFL player, a really good picture of ground contact. He ruptured his ACL on this movement. The other things that we know about this, and in particular change of direction, is that we get large ligamentous loads when there's increased knee valgus angles, increased moments on the ACL, as well as, and this is what we're going to really focus on today, is decreased flexion at initial contact, right? So look how extended his knee is. The ACL, the soccer picture above is also an ACL rupture that happened. Here's another example of that kind of foot outstretched outside of a narrow base of support, center of gravity, and you can see that extension and initial contact, and that was an ACL rupture as well. Now, Tim McGrath from Canberra, he discusses that the most important part of initial contact is within the actual first 30 milliseconds. He says that most ACL ruptures happen between 0 and 30 milliseconds of ground contact. There's another article that says it happens between 20 to 50 milliseconds. All we know is that it is fast, right? Faster than we can click our fingers. And if you have a look at that and that pace, how do we as physios control that and decrease those large ligamentous loads within that very, very first initial contact, and even what happens before initial contact for change of direction? The second aspect, that decreased flexion at initial contact, these are things that we're going to focus on today, in that we can somewhat objectively measure them using our valid force plates. Other people might use different force plates. And the questions that I want you guys to think about as we go through this is, how fast can that knee bend at or just before initial contact? And what can we do about it? Now, there's a million considerations. I said hundreds of thousands before. There's probably a million considerations, including the fact that we need our bodies to, we need physios to understand that our bodies are working on that subconscious control level at that really fast 0 to 30 milliseconds at initial ground contact. You can see in this picture, he's not concerned about what his knee's doing, what his ankle's doing. That player is concerned about his defending his attacking player, where the ball is, and trying to tackle him, right? So that subconscious control is what is really controlling his lower limb. The other aspect is the skills, the capacities, and motor control. First off, when we're thinking about ACL rehab clients is, can that rehab client get into that flexion position, or do they have restricted range of motion? Do they have the quad flexion, the quad eccentric capacity to hold the knee in that position? And then again, lastly, do they have that motor control to be able to do that? So this is why in the real early phases, that single leg squat off a box 290 degrees is absolutely key. If you can't do that, you probably either don't have the range of motion or the strength or the motor skill to be able to get your knee into positions that we want them to be in, rather than being in this real extended position. Cool. So just to summarize, and I will, again, I'll give you guys resources to go through, but effectively what we're doing today is we're going through the joint dynamics leading up to initial contact, and within that 0 to 30 milliseconds at initial contact. And so those are the absolute key things about maintaining ACL integrity during change of direction tasks, okay? We will go into poor neuromuscular control. We will go into things like pre-activation and what to do about that. But remember, this is all around dynamic tasks, okay? So what joint dynamics do we need to focus on leading up to initial contact to keep away from microscopic to macroscopic failure of any of the knee ligaments, right? And how do we use force plates to do it? Well, effectively what good physios do is they'll measure these specific things, right? Knee flexion, ability to have knee flexion at initial contact. Then we will train it and hopefully improve it. And then we are able to re-measure it. So all of those, the joint dynamics leading up to initial contact, we need it to be applicable to this individual client. We also need the measurements to be really accurate. And we're very lucky that we've got access to some of these things. So let's get into the nitty-gritty and the details, right? Hawken Dynamics have got a great summary of this counter movement jump. We will discuss single leg versus double leg counter movement jumps in detail in the next session, because there's, again, millions of considerations. But what we're going to look at today is not the unweighting phase, but the braking phase before concentric jump, right? So we're looking, the braking phase being eccentric assessment. And then we're also going to look at the initial landing, especially at landing stiffness or peak landing forces, and what that means for the knee in particular. This is what it looks like on the Veld graph, right? So the joint dynamics, effectively what we're saying here is we're looking at those two different phases because we want to assess eccentric control. Any questions on that? We will come back to this lots. A lot of the time, and a lot of the research looks into landing, because that's kind of, you know, landing, cutting, change of direction are the kinds of things that we try and train to avoid ACL ruptures. But what a lot of people skip out on is that eccentric phase during the loading of the jump is actually extremely important for us, right? So after the weighting, but before the concentric phase, that gives us probably the most amount of data and usable data when we're measuring just vertical ground reaction forces about what's happening in the lower limb. Now, some considerations around the actual force plates is that they don't permit the valve force, any force plates really, do not permit the quantification of joint-specific contributions, right? You need 3D kinematics to be able to do that. So the primary measurement that we're going through is vertical ground reaction force, but because we're not doing 3D kinematics, we don't know the exact forces happening at the ankle, the knee, and the hip. We're only estimating how much that's being spread, right? So it just means that we need to have that overview that we're not doing 3D kinematics on force plates. We're just purely measuring one specific measurement, which is force over time as a vertical ground reaction force. So we know that these things happen really quick. We know that we can somewhat objectively measure flexion at initial contact. And so the specifics that we're going to hear is the eccentric deceleration, right? The ED, and specifically the rate of force development. And this is what the force plates can tell us. Now, ED, RFD can be equated to an athlete's bounce or their stiffness, right? There's been some really good studies that collaborate the ED, RFD to vertical jump performance. And so we know that we can kind of interchange that if an athlete has very poor eccentric deceleration rate of force development, they've got very stiff, what we can assume to be ankle, knee, and hip. Cool. You guys all right with that? So if they've got very poor eccentric deceleration rate of force development, they're very stiff. If they've got very good ED, RFD, it means that they're really springy and really bouncy, right? So stiffness on, let's say, a landing, if they only do that, it might come up as ED, RFD really low. If they do that, it might come up as ED, RFD really high. Okay, we'll go through a few videos.
Question. I thought you needed to be like really quite stiff to be able to use your leg as a spring.
Yes, you do definitely. But what we're talking about today is staying away from this microscopic and macroscopic failure from a physics perspective.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about stiffness and performance, especially in, you know, when you go through Achilles ruptures and Achilles rehab, you do need to be able to build stiffness. But remember, that's in that physiological range in this graph. Okay, so you do need stiffness to be able to transmit force, but we're going beyond that. We're going beyond that physiological range today, and that's where I'm going to use excessive stiffness is not good.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So is that when we're doing the jump test, is that when we would be looking more at the qualitative aspects of the jump rather than just focusing on the graph, just to see?
Spot on. And this is where we're going to go through. You definitely have to combine the qualitative. So you have to see the strategies and the unloading strategies compared to the quantitative data. Very good questions.
Is that also what, like, if I guess this is more on the landing component, but is that also when we would see those multiple peaks on their landing, as if we could infer with, I guess, collaborating with the qualitative side of it, just infer that there might be a little bit too much stiffness. So they're getting that extra peak. They get their ankle going and then their knee's stiff, but then their hip drops down or their trunk drops down.
Correct. And so, I mean, this is much more in the next fortnight session, but especially on a single leg counter movement jump or a double leg counter movement jump, you're looking at all of those qualitative factors to try and piece together where they might be unloading. And at the end of the day, like zooming back into this, is do they have enough knee flexion and eccentric deceleration at the knee, i.e. can they absorb flexion forces through a range when they're landing, or when they're decelerating, or when it's important to understand that it's not just on the landing, because the deceleration aspect can happen in the jump phase or in the change of direction phase. Cool. So that's effectively the question is, you know, can the knee absorb that flexion, and can it happen through a larger range rather than 0 to 5 degrees? Can it happen 0 to 30 degrees in that first 0 to 30 milliseconds at initial contact? And so that's kind of the breakdown of the eccentric deceleration rate of force development that we'll look at. Cool. So if we've got reduced active range of motion, and I'm just going to change this now and just give you guys some examples. So if someone lands really stiff knee, it's very different to production of force and concentric production of force and stiffness when we're going through concentric, right? So if we're looking at someone landing with real stiffness compared to someone landing and able to absorb that force, and looking at, okay, can someone absorb that force quickly or do they do it really slowly? And so I'll show some examples. This is really stiff. This is really slow. This is really fast. Cool?
So you want to be quick and controlled.
Correct, yeah. So can you guys do those 3 for me so you understand what it looks like in your body?
Sure. Let me just shuffle this around.
And have a look at left to right. See how that feels differently, left to right. So single leg stiff. Yeah, other leg. Good. Now single leg, large range of motion, slow. Slower, Aaron, slower. Yeah. So kind of like a jump and land or a stick, yeah? And now do it quickly. Nadia, try a larger range of motion quickly. More flexion, more flexion. There you go. Yeah. Try it again, Aaron. Yeah, good. Cool.
Like the interactive component.
So let's go through. I'm just going to come out of this share. New share. Let's go. What can you guys see?
I can see like that initial graph that you were showing about the eccentric stuff.
Oh,
Force deck kind of trace.
where is this? Here we go. All right, cool. So let's go through. I will mute this guy because he's rather annoying. Quade Cooper, perfect video footage. Unfortunately, not high definition, but you can see that where he just changes direction. You see how it happens fast, and have a look at his knee flexion, right? So it'll show you just a couple of other images. Within 30 milliseconds.
Cool.
Oh, here's Hector Bellerin. You can see that position, right? He's just put his foot down.
This kid's okay, yeah.
Well. You can see he's already done it there. He falls down, clutches the knee. You can even see the pivot shift on this one. Yeah, there. You see how quickly it happens, right? So let's go back to this one. So the joint dynamics leading up to IC. When you guys are doing that landing, where do you think, what phase are you focusing your stiffness on and assessing that stiffness in this whole graph here? So effectively, I got you guys to do a single leg counter movement jump, right?
So in the eccentrics,
Yeah.
I guess both eccentric phases in the lead up to the jump and also the land.
See, I think it was mainly the landing, right? So let's now focus on the lead up to the jump, right? And I'll get you guys to do that single leg again, but I'll show you the focus being on, let's turn this down, the focus not being on the landing, but the focus actually being on that drop, right? Just before you take off. So now, and let's see how much quicker it is than the actual landing. Give that a crack. Yeah. So let's focus on stiffness to start with. Super stiff. Cool. And now let's work on slow, large range of motion. Yeah. And again, try it. And now try fast, large range of motion. Cool. Awesome. So come back over.
That actually made such a big difference on the first one.
And you'll notice, you know, when we're taught in uni, a lot of the time we focus on quantitative and qualitative measures of landing, but very rarely do we focus on that initial eccentric component before the concentric of a jump, right? And that is more closely linked than the landing to these change of direction 0 to 30 millisecond large ligamentous forces, right? And so this is where I'd really like to steer you guys down this path, is when you get someone doing a single leg counter movement jump, focus on that, the strategies that they've got, the qualitative strategies that they've got in that phase, and the landing is still important, but in that phase mainly. Cool. So effectively, what we're going to start looking at is this eccentric decel, the rate of force development, asymmetry. Asymmetry is much more important towards the end phases than it is in the middle phases. It's still valuable information. But instead of absolutes, because what you'll see in absolutes is that this ED-RFD will increase early on, and then towards kind of months 8 to 12 post ACL, it should be much, much higher. But the key thing with this, especially in a single leg counter movement jump, the ED-RFD, towards the end phases, the asymmetries here are much, much higher left to right compared to early on, right? Whereas if you're looking at a double leg counter movement jump, it's the opposite. Double leg is more valuable, showing the asymmetries early, and then later on, the double leg ED-RFD asymmetries kind of come back into line, right? So early phases, we're looking at double leg to see those massive asymmetries. Later on, we're looking at single leg asymmetries. Now, the difference between double leg counter movement jump and single leg counter movement jump. When you're looking at offloading strategies, right? And I'll give you a quick example. An offloading of a double leg counter movement jump might be that I work on that or this. So that's an extremely exaggerated unloading mechanism that I've been using. When you do a single leg counter movement jump, you take out half of the body, and really you can only do different unloading strategies within that single limb, right? So here's what a single leg counter movement jump unloading strategy looks like. I'll go from the side actually. Compared to maybe this. So very, very different unloading strategies. Now, this is why it's important to use double leg and single leg counter movement jumps, because of that unloading. But the trends that we're looking at overall, we have to look at the asymmetries left to right. Cool, any questions on that?
That's good.
The information that this provides then enables us to make relevant decisions around eccentric force absorption, right? And effectively what we're looking at is this will then guide us into deceleration strategies that we can implement in rehab that hopefully then carry over to pitch-based deceleration progression. Cool. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at today is progression of higher velocity eccentric decel capacity. Okay. The reason why we do this is because eccentric deceleration capacity in running athletes, change of direction in a fast, small amount of flexion, initial contact, this ED capacity allows us to stay within that physiological range of the graft and stop it from going into micro or macroscopic failure aspects of that graph. Cool. The other considerations here is that we're just measuring one thing, right? Again, one of thousands of considerations, but this is a very, very good place to start. It also starts getting you thinking about, okay, well, if this is the eccentric deceleration that we're measuring in a single leg counter movement jump, and we'll have a look at the other side, you can then start to piece together patterns of, okay, why is this happening or why is this happening? And then what's the next phase, right? So what we do see is that there's a persistence of eccentric phase avoidance strategies that we see in post-ACLR clients. And this is why it's so important that eccentric control of knee flexion is one of the most undervalued aspects of rehab early on. Again, I know we discussed this in the last one around, return to running, but I can see people who have been, especially on social media, I see people who have been through an ACLR, they're running, they're changing direction, but their eccentric deceleration capacity is absolutely awful, right? So this is where you've got to question, okay, well, we know what aspects an ACL ruptures at. It doesn't matter if someone's doing a triple crossover hop and they're getting really good scores, or they're getting really good vertical ground reaction forces. The return to training, NFL footballers, they're already, running routes and catching balls, but they can't, their eccentric deceleration capacity is absolutely awful, especially fast, right? You'll see other aspects of measurement where they can do these things, but they can only do it 0 to 100 milliseconds or, 70 to 100 milliseconds. And they haven't even tested or timed within 0 to 30. And so this is why rate of force development is included in this and is really important. Cool. So this is about identifying these deficits and really working out what can we do to improve it. So the qualitative aspect of this is super important. We will go through this at some stage, and especially unloading of the injured limb. It can progress into unloading of the injured limb early on. And you can see that, there's a lot of suggestion that to prevent maladaptive unloading, we've got to change that unloading of the injured limb, even when they start squatting, right? So let's say 6 weeks post, when they start unloading the injured limb, you've got to ask yourself, well, why are they doing that? If they're doing it on a 30-kilo back squat and they're unloading that injured limb, this is why you have to go back to that capacity. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the range of motion? Do they have the strength, right? And the asymmetries. The asymmetries allow us to show and measure progress, specifically in these high velocity eccentric decel capacities and strategies as well. Cool. Lots of crazy big words there. So if you're not a physio watching this or a strength and conditioning coach, then I think you're struggling a little bit. Any questions on that so far? So let me show you this eccentric decel in rehab. New share. This one. Zoom share. I've got so many different tabs open. All right, here is a perfect example from our friends at Athletes Authority, right? So they discuss this. They discuss eccentric rate of force development, and they discuss this in the kind of range of the plyometric continuum, Narnia, before considering depth jumps. And you'll see this, right? This should happen before depth jumps or before advanced plyos. We're starting to work on eccentric RFD already. And here's a really good video around it. Where in the plyometric continuum, in Lockheed's plyo continuum, would you think this sits?
At the very start for eccentric absorption. Correct,
yeah. And do you reckon we start doing these things before we start running? Yeah. So we actually do it. It's just about us being aware of why we're doing it. And, you know, the end goal. How does this lead into running? How does this then lead into our plyometrics and higher velocity aspects? And why are we doing all these things? We know it's because of those mechanisms of ACL ruptures, right? We're trying to stay out of, let's do this one again.
I've just got to jet off, Bryan. My patient's just arrived.
Yeah, cool. Not a problem. I'll just record the rest of this. I think we've got a few more slides, so sorry for taking too long.
No, not at all, sorry.
We'll chat soon.
Lovely.
So the last thing that we'll go through is this deceleration and acceleration, right? At what phase are we testing this? When we return to sport, the analogy that I like to use is that we're testing the brakes on something going 100 kilometers an hour or faster. When we're in the gym scenario, a lot of the time, we're only testing, and this is where the absolute values of the eccentric deceleration come into it. We're only testing the car driving out of the driveway compared to this, right? And this is where the absolute values are still really important. Asymmetries show significant amount of information, but we also need this progressive stimulation and this progressive overload that we need to get the athlete being the Porsche going down the freeway at 100, 200 kilometers an hour and then testing those brakes. Cool. And that's really the last consideration that we'll go through today, and how it then progresses from what we've gone through. All that physiological aspects, how does that relate to function, then range of motion, strength, motor control, which then progresses into eccentric deceleration. And then next fortnight, we'll go through hopping and testing specifics.
Beautiful.
Excellent. Thanks, Bryan.
Thanks, mate.
Hope that's good.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
And yeah, I'll chat soon, guys.
Talk to you soon, mate.
Chat soon.
All right.